A seminal moment in 20th century music occurred in May of 1913. At the time, this event went unnoticed, but it changed the world of music forever. I'm not talking about the scandal surrounding the premiere of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring at the Ballet Russe in Paris. I'm also not talking about the scandal concert in Vienna, during which performances of new music by Berg, Webern, and Schoenberg caused the audience to riot in disgust. The event I'm referring to was completely overshadowed by these scenes of legendary uproar. This event was more like the touch of death in karate. It silently set into motion a series of events whose reverberations wouldn't be felt for decades. I'm talking about the premiere of Debussy's Jeux. On May 15, 1913, 2 weeks before the premiere of Stravinsky's Reihe, the same Ballet Russe in Václav Nijinsky premiered an unassuming ballet by 51-year-old Claude Debussy called Jeux. It was poorly received, but not in the cool, riot-inducing way. Instead, the audience was bored. The press didn't take notice, and the Ballet Russe never performed it again. 2 weeks later, the gigantic, chaotic production of the Reihe took place, and it was almost as if Debussy's piece had never even happened. However, in the 1950s, the reverberations of Jeux, whose 17-minute score rarely rises above a piano dynamic, became deafening, thanks in large part to composer, conductor, and generally badass Frenchman Pierre Boulez.
De retrouver Pierre Boulez dans des œuvres de Claude Debussy.
Here's Boulez conducting the new Philharmonia Orchestra in London in 1966. Boulez studied with, amongst other people, Olivier Messiaen and spent his life championing the work of Claude Debussy. Debussy had been referred to as an impressionist all his life, at first in derogatory reference to Monet's improvisatory paintings, then later as a compliment by critics that Debussy despised. For Boulez, Debussy was akin to a sculptor more than a painter. Each of his projects blooms from its own logical seeds. In Boulez's mind, Debussy's contemporaries were beholden to one of two supreme leaders, either stultifying, unquestioned tradition or mathematical dodecaphonic patterns. In both cases, to Boulez, the composer lazily outsourced his art to a color-by-numbers rubric, but not Debussy. Yet, somehow in my opinion, Debussy's influence on contemporary music remains misunderstood. His gorgeous early works of genius, Clair de Lune and Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, solidified his reputation as an impressionist. The forbidding technical difficulty of his later works makes them less likely to be programmed, and thus they are heard much less often. The inability of conventional analysis to rise to meet the occasion of describing Debussy's technique accurately has left academics befuddled. So in this video, I'm going to explore Debussy's Jeux on its own terms. We'll do a deep reading of a few excerpts of that score, along with necessarily exploring some of his earlier compositions. Along the way, I will do my best to convey how and why Debussy's quiet ballet caused a musical revolution. I will also show what we have to learn from modernism. I will argue that in our age of burgeoning AI music creation, Debussy's unanalyzable, improvisatory approach to construction is more important than ever before. This is Score Study with me, Brian Kroc. Part 1, Symbolist Songs. When I was in college at the University of Illinois, my composition teacher, Reynold Tharp, urged me to attend a concert at Symphony Center. The Chicago Symphony Orchestra was playing György Ligety's violin concerto under the baton of none other than Pierre Boulez. That piece became so near to my heart, and it shook me awake to my own calling as a composer. I became a lifelong Ligety acolyte. I remember that half of the concert in granular detail. I have absolutely no recollection of the other half of the program, in which Boulez conducted Claude Debussy's The Martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. I remember knowing that Debussy wrote dreamy, flowery, approachable piano music, and his presence on a program with Ligety seemed like an outlier to my uneducated mind. The Martyrdom made absolutely no impression on me. I'm sure it was beautiful, but it had none of the outward complexity, daring sonorities, and emotional turmoil of Ligety's masterpiece. I didn't know then that Boulez had been championing Debussy's music for 50 plus years at that point. As early as 1956, in his essay, Corruption in the Censors, Boulez made the argument that I am making in this video. He says, quote, "Brusque and brutal mutations have hidden from us those kinds of change of which one is less aware in the short term, but which in the long term make more impact. Symbolism is dispersed by Apollinaire and then by the Surrealist Revolution. Cubism strips Cézanne bare. The bassoon of the right replaces the flute of the faun." But he goes on to say, while the once neglected poets and painters are now universally celebrated, the reverberations of Jeux still seem to me mysteriously unspent. Achille Claude Debussy was born on August 22nd, 1862, into a poor family. He seems destined for a musical career when you hear the Byzantine story of how his father's cellmate in prison was the son of a former pupil of Chopin's, whose daughter married the influential symbolist poet Paul Verlaine, and who takes young Claude on as a student. Although he got a late start at the piano, he showed so much promise that he auditioned for the Paris Conservatory and was accepted not on the merit of his technique, which was suspect, but because of a palpable musicality that showed promise. His teachers universally chided him for being too experimental and were the first people to stamp the label impressionist on his music. It was not intended as a compliment. Debussy instinctually despised the rules of the Academy and could not be bullied off his individual path. Pierre Boulez referred to Debussy as a, quote, autodidact from choice, because he was not unlearned. In fact, he was able to win the coveted Prix de Rome by writing according to its rules. But he was an autodidact by choice because he consciously disavowed those very rules. He was drawn more to the arts of poetry and painting than to the paint-by-numbers music that his teachers and peers were creating. He loved to sit at the piano and improvise rather than developing flawless technique through exercises. And as a composer, he expressed himself accordingly. Take, for example, his early song, Green, composed in January of 1886. It is a setting of Paul Verlaine, yes, the same Verlaine who married his piano teacher's daughter, from a poetry collection called Aquarelle, or watercolors, which were meant to evoke the fluidity of painting. Music inspired by poetry, inspired in turn by painting. This is emblematic of Debussy's art. In Green, we can already hear Debussy experimenting with many of the revolutionary techniques that would occupy him throughout his life. Let me point out a few. First, and perhaps most importantly, is elasticity of rhythm. Debussy was constantly utilizing polyrhythm, implied polymeter, and changing time signatures to create a less strict rhythmic pulse. Superimposed groups of 2 and 3 are everywhere in Debussy. While the piano part subdivides triplets, the vocal line subdivides even eighth notes. This creates a fluid feeling of time. The other thing to note is chromaticism. Green is a rare Debussy composition in a minor key, A flat minor to be exact. And in measures 1 and 2, we hear a rising chromatic line, which carries harmonic implications with it. A flat minor morphs into E major, which morphs into F diminished. But within just a few measures, the harmony goes off the rails. D flat 7 and G flat 7 lead us to A7 in measure 13, which is a half step away from our home key and completely unprepared by the harmony leading towards it. Part 2, original orchestrations. As Debussy grew sick of the ivory tower of the conservatory, he started hanging at cafes with artists like Jean Moreau. He set poetry to music by Baudelaire, from whom he learned modernity, which he described as, quote, the art of an inquiring savage discovering music step by step through his emotions. Form depends on and is made up of successive minute touches mysteriously linked together by means of an instinctive clairvoyance. That couldn't describe Debussy's music more perfectly. The great symbolist poet Stéphane Mallarmé heard Debussy's setting of Baudelaire's poetry and was inspired to ask him to create incidental music for a staged presentation of his poem L'après-midi d'un faun, the afternoon of a faun. Debussy responded by writing one of the stone-cold classics of orchestral literature, the prelude to the afternoon of a faun. When Mallarmé heard it for the first time in 1892, he said, quote, this music prolongs the emotion of my poem and sets its decor more passionately than its color. The prolongation that Mallarmé felt is due in large part to Debussy's purposeful dissolution of bar lines. Just like in Green, he strives for an elasticity that makes time signatures and measures strictly practical. They keep the orchestra together, but they're often obscured by the music. Look, for example, at the first page of the prelude. The well-known flute solo introduces an almost chromatic theme that completely obscures the time. We feel strong beats on beat 7 of measure 3 and beat 4 of measure 4, where the woodwinds enter. If we didn't see the bar lines, I'm sure most people would feel these stresses as 3 bars of 6/8 rather than 2 bars of 9. Ambiguity of time is met with ambiguity of harmony. Although Debussy liked to shit-talk Wagner, he was certainly influenced by his Tristan and Isolde. Debussy provides the key of E major in the score. The melody does sound like it lands firmly in E major in measure 3. But then the first 2 chords are A sharp half diminished 7, which voice leads chromatically to B flat 7. B flat 7 is a tritone away from E major, so functionally, without the aid of the score, we would have no idea where we were if we were to analyze this piece according to the conventions of classical music theory. But Debussy didn't write according to conventions. He was led exclusively by his ear. After 6 full beats of silence, the A sharp half diminished 7 and B flat 7 chord are repeated with a new note appended to the B flat 7 chord. E natural, the sharp 11 scale degree of that chord, and the root of our home key. This emphasizes the tritone that was outlined in measure 1 by the flute's melody. That E then leads chromatically to F and then F sharp as the third of a D major triad, harmonizing the flute melody's second appearance. That D major triad morphs into G7 in second inversion, which morphs via chromaticism to B7 over D sharp, which finally leads to our home key of E major. However, as a listener, we would have no way of knowing that was our home key because Debussy lands there only fleetingly. Debussy's chromaticism was jarring to his teachers and peers, but not to his audience. Unlike most of the modernist composers to follow him, he abandoned tonality in search of ever more beautiful sounds. I have shown how chromaticism and elasticity of time are key features in Debussy's early compositions. And finally, I think the prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun is remarkable for its orchestration. Considering Debussy had written almost exclusively piano music up to this point, it's unbelievable how in control of the orchestra he is. He would continue to grow as an exacting orchestrator throughout his life. He was known to belabor each individual orchestration decision, taking days to work on just one score page. Debussy continually discovered new, delicate, and exciting ways to utilize the instruments of the orchestra. Look at the harp tuning in measure 4, for example. Each string is tuned up or down to create only 4 pitches, the same 4 pitches as the half diminished chord in bar 3. So when the harp plays that glissando, it creates a stunning effect. Look then at the strings in measures 7 and 8. Debussy chooses to place the A-sharp half diminished chord exclusively in Debussy violins, and then the B-flat 7 chord is exclusively played by Debussy violas, celli, and basses. This is asking a lot of the orchestra. It requires the utmost nuance and delicacy to prevent this from sounding sloppy because the writing doesn't really help to attach these two chords together. Rather, each individual harmonic sonority is tied to its own instrumental palette. Rather than one smooth brushstroke, this approach is like piecing together unique, colorful shards into a mosaic, or creating the effect of shimmering water with the dabs of a paintbrush like Monet. Part 3, Jeux. Fast forward 20 years. Debussy has made friends with a younger generation of geniuses. Stravinsky, Ravel, and Satie are all in Paris creating works that light a competitive fire under Debussy. Non-Western influences, such as the Javanese gamelan that he heard at the Paris exhibition, have opened his ears to new harmonic terrain. Incessant smoking, non-existent exercise, and a troubled personal life have rendered his health fragile. Periods of creative fervor are punctuated by extended writer's block as Debussy pursues ambitious theatrical projects that go nowhere. Amidst all this, Debussy receives a commission from Sergei Diaghilev to produce a score for his ballet Russe. On its face, the idea seems bland. A tennis player loses a stray ball, comes across 2 mischievous girls, and they play childish games like hide and seek. However, like the music Debussy crafted for its production, there was more to the plot of Jeux than met the eye. First of all, it would be the first time that Nijinsky, or any man for that matter, had ever danced on point in a ballet, believe it or not. Secondly, the supposed innocence of the plot concealed Diaghilev's real-life sexual fantasies for a menage a trois with Nijinsky himself. Nijinsky always spurned Diaghilev's advances. In Jeux, Debussy takes chromaticism, harmony, orchestration, and formal development to the furthest reaches they had ever been explored to that point. Before the curtain opens, we hear 16 measures of alternating chromaticism and whole tone sonorities. The voicings in measures 5 through 8 feature 2
augmented triads
stacked on top of each other so that all 6 pitches in the whole tone scale are sounding simultaneously. This sonority is heard exclusively in the opening and the closing of the ballet and nowhere else. When the curtain rises, we hear the germ of a theme played by the clarinet in measure 49. In the journal
Die Reihe
in 1959, Herbert Eimert published a motivic table that shows how Debussy subtly morphs this little snippet of an idea into dozens of individual themes. These culminate in the pas de trois in measure 566 in a melody played by the English horn and the French horns. Technically, this is the first time we've heard this specific gorgeous melody. However, Debussy has been laying little clues throughout the first 15 minutes of his piece, which germinate in unanalyzable ways. Eimert calls this a vegetative form, which I love. In analysis, a lot is made of forms that are perfectly symmetrical and easy to follow. Scholars will point to examples in nature that follow rules, like the Fibonacci sequence, for example. But what interests Debussy is the organic mess that exists all over nature and that doesn't conform to elegant mathematical structures. The pas de trois melody grows into the only loud section of the entire ballet. In fact, according to Eimert, 80% of Jeux is either piano or pianissimo, and then less than 0.3% is forte. This brief moment of ecstasy culminates in a triple kiss amongst the 3 dancers on stage. An extremely subversive moment in 20th century art, if ever I've encountered one, albeit a very, very subtle one. Conclusion. Unfortunately, only 2 weeks after the premiere of Jeux, there was a very unsubtle moment of subversion in the very same theater, performed by the very same company. Stravinsky's Rite of Spring was premiered, solidifying Stravinsky's reputation as a cutting-edge auteur to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, while Stravinsky and his peers worshipped the ground that Debussy walked on, and audiences generally enjoyed the obvious beauty of Debussy's creations, there was little room for his quiet brand of experimentation in 20th century classical music. That is, until Pierre Boulez arrived on the scene in the 1950s. Boulez heard in Debussy everything that was missing from the avant-garde of his time. And I believe that Debussy's music is more relevant today than ever before. Even before the unstoppable advent of AI music, technology was pushing the art of composition to more and more four-square results. For example, when you open a new file on notation software programs, bar lines are presented to you immediately in 4/4 time. When you create in digital audio workstations, looping encourages incessant repetition, again, usually in 4/4 time. Now, computer code is able to create new songs in seconds based on the entire catalog of recorded sound. All of that is missing magic of the kind that Debussy spent his whole life searching for. New sounds that ebb and flow like water, sparkling orchestrations that never repeat, organic forms that grow according to their own inexplicable logic. These are the qualities that we have to learn from studying the music of Claude Debussy.